So I'm really, really excited to be chairing this session. I'm just holding the book up because I think, Angela, when you held it up, it receded into the seaside background. So, so I'm really excited to welcome Professor Alison Phipps. And I read the book, and I have to say that I found it really powerful, inspiring, and so clearly written. I think that it's accessible to anybody. You don't have to be an academic to read it. It was free of any kind of jargon, and I found it a really, really great book. And I was actually struck by the words that you used to describe the main aim of the book. And I'm just going to quote from the book now. This book is about violence, especially the violence we can do in the name of fighting sexual violence. And I just wondered, why did you write this book and why now?
Thank you, Donna. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming as well, and especially people who had to fight to get in. Very much appreciated. And thank you so much, Donna, for your kind words about my book. That is so lovely to hear, especially the bit about it being accessible, because that was one of the main aims. So I wrote the book following 15 years of activism really on sexual violence in universities as part of the mainstream feminist movement. So I'm a white woman, I'm an academic, I live a middle-class life, I work in a very middle-class job, and I've been part of this group of activists who were fighting to do something about sexual violence in universities. And there are loads and loads of amazing women and people of other genders working in that field. But as I kind of progressed through, I found myself feeling more and more uneasy about it. And I was uneasy about a few things. So first of all, about the reliance on criminal punishment, which, you know, as I got deeper and deeper into Black feminist theory, I felt more and more uncomfortable with, and I felt more and more convinced that the criminal punishment system is not there to keep us safe, or it's not there to keep all of us safe. It's about protecting elite interests, protecting private property, protecting capitalism, not about reducing harm. And you can see that from the things that are defined as crimes and the things that aren't defined as crimes. And then my second source of unease was sort of linked to that, which was about the use of institutional discipline against perpetrators in universities, which is not to say that I don't think survivors deserve spaces without abusers. I do. But the main question I had was, where do they go? Where do these men go? And I was concerned about the pass the harasser problem, where we just are passing these men on to different institutions. But even if we manage to exclude these men from academia, where do they go next? And maybe they go to other professions, lower status professions, where women might have less rights and less protections. And then I was also concerned about the use of the corporate media to name and shame perpetrators or institutions. Again, not because I don't think that naming is not necessarily a good strategy, but I thought we're putting our head in the lion's mouth here, because the corporate media does not care about social justice. The corporate media cares about the perpetuation of the corporate media. And I saw, you know, a couple of survivors really get their heads bitten by putting their heads in the lion's mouth because their perpetrators happen to have a better story. And I thought, this can't be it. This can't be, maybe this is one strategy, but we're mistaking this for justice. And I guess I wrote the book after Me Too happened, which sort of brought all this stuff to a head for me. And when I say Me Too, I mean the kind of media mainstream of Me Too. And it's really an attempt to reach out to other white women who might be feeling similarly uneasy, but they can't put their finger on it. And to kind of start a conversation where we think together about what it is that white feminism does and what the limitations are. So when you said, Donna, we cannot end violence by doing violence, I think what I want to do is to encourage white feminists to see interpersonal violence, state violence, the violence of war, the violence of capitalism as part of a piece. And I think we often don't, because our feminism is quite one-dimensional, and I think that Black feminists often do, because they're working with different intersections, and obviously because Black communities are much more subject to state violence than white ones are. And then the last thing I want to say is that I see my book as a bit of a transitional object, really. So I've written it to be very accessible, and I see it as a way for fellow white women to move on to the work of people who are much more clever and much more cooler than me. So Angela Davis or Mariam Kaba or Lola Olufemi or whoever that is, I hope to be a kind of a conduit. And I think that sometimes for white people, it's easier to hear it from another white person, or they might not know where to start. So that was the aim.
Okay, that is really fascinating. I just wanted to probably probe a little bit into, you mentioned quite a number of sort of Black feminist scholars that have influenced you in terms of your work. And I think somebody that you quote pretty often is Sarah Ahmed. You've quoted her in the book, and Sarah Ahmed called herself a willful child. And you have also mentioned that you think of yourself as a willful child, as somebody who does not fit in. You also say that you're a queer woman, and I'm quoting from you now, with non-paradigm experiences of sexual trauma. And I know you also quoted Audre Lorde and another fabulous queer feminist scholar as well. And she speaks about silence and the fact that, your silence will not protect you. So you need to speak, and you need to speak out about trauma. So trauma isn't out there. It's a way of being, if you don't speak about trauma, then it consumes you inside. And I just wondered, what did you mean by being having a non-paradigm experience? And is the book a way for you to speak out about trauma?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and nobody's asked me that before. So I thank you for that. What I mean by a non-paradigm experience is that I was not raped by a white man, which is normally the experience of fellow white women, I think, statistically. I was actually assaulted. I mean, I call it rape. In law, it wouldn't be defined as rape, but it was certainly experienced as rape by another woman. And by a woman in a much more marginalized social position than me. And I think that has very much framed my perspective, because I could see very clearly through that experience how actually, if I had invoked the criminal punishment system after that experience, I would have harmed her potentially even more than she had harmed me. And I'm not saying that to kind of judge other survivors. I have no interest in telling other survivors what to do. My kind of book is about the mainstream feminist movement and how it presents solutions, and it's almost about the lack of options available to survivors. So Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you, and I think that's right. I think we need to have ways to speak out, but it seems that often for survivors of sexual violence, it's either criminal punishment or silence, or speaking out in the corporate media or silence, unless you're lucky enough to be living somewhere where there's transformative justice work going on. So I think that I've lost the thread of what I was going to say now, but I think that gave me a slightly different perspective on it, which is something that I wanted to kind of apply to the mainstream feminist movement as a whole. And the book is, it's kind of a way for me to speak out about my trauma, although I've never kind of fully shared that whole story in public, and I don't know whether I ever would. But I think it's also a way for me to speak out and understand my positioning within this mainstream movement, because I've never felt like I fitted in, and I've always felt uneasy. Which is a kind of theme that's run all the way through my life. I mean, when I say I'm a willful child, I really was and still am, the black sheep of my family, and in some ways the kind of the black sheep of the mainstream feminist movement in a way, or maybe just an annoying person that sits on people's shoulders and says, have you thought about this? So I guess the book was my attempt to make sense of all of that, really.
Okay, so this notion of political whiteness that you refer to in the book, which seems to be quite a central concept in the book, which sort of was popularized previously by Ho Sang in 2010. And you sort of relate it to the backlash. Could you probably, sort of explain that a bit more?
Yes. So I think political whiteness, I wanted to explore whiteness in more depth, because we've been having lots of conversations about white feminism, but it's often been quite poorly defined or just quite broadly defined in terms of what it tends to focus on. But I think that what I was trying to think about was why. And the idea of political whiteness I drew from Ho Sang's work, and also Gominda Bambra, who talks about methodological whiteness. And in Ho Sang's work, political whiteness is more the kind of backlash, kind of whites first type politics. And in Bambra's work, it's more about kind of erasing or minimizing histories of colonialism. I think what I wanted to do was think about how whiteness structures even politics that calls itself progressive, but also how that links. And I think that some of the dynamics I saw in mainstream feminism, so the kind of the centering of a victim identity, the reliance on, the state to deliver solutions, all the institution to deliver solutions, I really started to understand via the idea of whiteness, which is not about skin color or identity. It's about relationships to white supremacy and the way in which these types of politics situate themselves within the status quo. And I relate it to the backlash in terms of, the first thing that made me think about relating it to the backlash was Me Too, really, when you had all of these disclosures of sexual violence, which were often made by white and middle class women, not always, but often. And then you had all these white middle class men claiming to be victimized by Me Too. So you had kind of competing claims of victimhood. And obviously, some of these were genuine and some of these are not. But there's a kind of a thread that links them both. And I think that that says something about white supremacy, because I think supremacy actually produces a focus on victimhood, because when you're in a position of power, you become preoccupied with threat. And white women who are sexually violated might not feel powerful, and they're not powerful in that moment, but they occupy a position of power in white supremacy. So I was trying to kind of pull at those threads and sort of understand how those things are related. And it may be that political whiteness doesn't survive that long as a type of analysis. I think that it's probably a lot more grainy than that. There's class dynamics that need to be pulled out further, I think. But I wanted to kind of center race because I thought it's long past time we did that in our analyses of mainstream feminism.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about centering race, and I think a lot of the times when people talk about race, they don't think that it applies to white people. Race usually, it applies to people who are not white. And I just wondered that as a white person, do you think that, how do you feel about taking on this challenge of centering race, in the sense of race being about sort of Black feminism and that sort of perspective? How do you feel as a white woman actually, voicing this kind of discussion?
Yeah, I think I feel very ambivalent about it because, for a start, I think that I wouldn't want to situate myself as an expert on race. I think, I'm not even an expert on whiteness. I think what I've written about is white feminism. And I'm also aware that there's a kind of industry of critical whiteness studies, which is basically about white people sort of navel gazing and patting ourselves on the back and not really about doing anything different. And I've no desire to be part of that. I've no desire to, become the next Robin DiAngelo going around the world charging 20 grand a pop for a workshop. That's not at all interesting to me. And it was really important to me when I wrote the book to donate the royalties from the book to projects by and for Black women, because I don't want to be profiting off of this. So I feel quite ambivalent about that. I also think that I will be experiencing a lot of defensiveness from other white people. I mean, so far, actually, I haven't so much. There's been some defensiveness, but not as much as I thought. And the defensiveness tends to come from the places that you expect it to come from. So either from the kind of more reactionary part of feminism that I spend quite a lot of time criticizing in the book, the anti-trans and anti-sex work feminism, or from white feminists on the radical socialist left who already feel that their politics are perfect and don't like being asked to kind of contemplate their own whiteness in a way. So I think that will probably happen. But I also think it's long past time that white people started to talk about whiteness in a productive way, and ways of trying to, I think Marilyn Fry says, it's about being disloyal to whiteness. It's about trying to find ways to undermine it and that does require work on the self. It does. As long as self-analysis doesn't become politics. And I think that some of that labor needs to be taken off of Black people and other people of color, because it must be exhausting.
Yeah. I'm not even going to talk about exhaustion right now. But I was really I'm interested though. Did you get any feedback from Black feminists or Black women? What was their if you got feedback, what was it like? What was it,
I did. I mean, I got feedback from kind of friends and colleagues while I was writing the book, obviously, but I also got some lovely feedback from Black feminists and Black women who and feminists of color who were sent the book before it came out. So I mean, it was one of the proudest moments of my life when Mariam Kaba agreed to endorse my book, because I just
see it at the back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so inspired by her, and she's so busy, and the fact that she would take the time to read my book and think it was useful was, a fantastic. It was such a gift to me. So I did get that feedback, and I've had some very nice feedback from Black feminists and Black women since the book came out, who've kind of said, you've managed to put your finger on some of the things that I feel uncomfortable with about white feminism and wasn't really sure why, which is another thing that I really treasure, because that was the aim. It was to kind of write a critique of white feminism from the inside and to be kind of a critical friend, to white feminism as well. I mean, I'm sure there are also lots of women of color and feminists of color who would think the book was incredibly basic and would probably not need to read it, because, in a lot of ways, I'm drawing on ideas that have been circulating for a long time.
Yeah, I just want to sort of return to this notion of the carceral feminism that you spoke about in the book. And certainly you have sort of strongly argued against it. And I wondered, what should be done with those who commit sexual violence?
Yes, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? That's the question I always get, and that's the question I hate answering, because I actually, I don't know. And that's the problem, isn't it? Thinking in an abolitionist way is, by its very nature, incomplete and unfinished, because it requires us to imagine a world that we don't have yet. I think that one of the things I always say in response to that is I am not telling individual survivors not to report to the police if they want to do that. I think that every survivor needs to do what they need to do in order to feel safe, or in order to feel that they have justice. But what I'm saying is that the mainstream movement, even if it continues to engage with criminal punishment, it needs to also start imagining alternatives, because lots of survivors don't want to report to the criminal punishment system anyway, but there's no other alternative. It's similar to in institutions as well, isn't it? You often have either an incredibly punitive disciplinary process, or you have nothing. And I think that mainstream feminism is implicated in this lack of options because we don't spend enough time imagining alternatives and we limit ourselves to what is within the status quo. I mean, I think that if we had a world where we had proper kind of social safety nets, better education, better healthcare, better equality of all types between people, there would probably be a reduction in sexual violence. I think that there are probably very few people who are so dangerous that they need to be kept away from others for everybody's protection. There may well be some of those left once we've kind of changed the world. And I think that there still needs to be ways in which to keep people safe, but probably that wouldn't involve locking them up and throwing away the key. And obviously that's a kind of a utopian vision, but I think that what we can do now is, even if we still continue to engage with the criminal punishment system, we can start building alternatives in the here and now. We can start kind of lobbying for better social safety nets. We can start lobbying for, you know, better healthcare, better education. We can start exploring transformative justice approaches that are survivor-led, which, you know, there's a variety of different ways that those can work. We can start lobbying for more collective forms of reproduction. So I'm aware that my answer is not completely satisfactory because it never will be, I don't think.
Yeah, you know, I have just so many questions to ask, but I'm conscious of the time, actually. I just glanced at my clock and saw it, but I do have one. I have several questions and I might still ask them later on, but just the last question in this particular session. You seem to be somebody who is a little bit anti-establishment, I would say. I don't know if you would agree with that.
How dare you?
But at the sort of end of the book, you know, you end with this kind of toolkit for fellow white feminists, and you have 6 questions. And I just wondered, because I always feel get a bit hot under the collar when I see this word toolkit. Because it sounds quite prescriptive. Yeah. And I just wondered why you decided to sort of use that language of toolkit, and, you know, why did you decide to end with this kind of toolkit idea?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think toolkit, I don't know why I chose that word. And I'm not particularly attached to that word. So, you know, if there would be a better word to describe it, I think that I would be happy to use it. I mean, Sarah Ahmed at the end of her book calls her kind of conclusion a feminist killjoy survival kit. But I didn't want to say survival kit because I think it's about more than that, because I'm talking to more than just, I mean, I'm not actually primarily talking to survivors of sexual violence who are kind of deep in their trauma. I actually think that, you know, survivors of sexual violence need to be supported in whatever they want to do. And it's down to the rest of us who are either not survivors or maybe who are survivors who might have processed some of our trauma to kind of build the world that we want and the feminism that we want. And I guess I picked toolkit because it's about building. And I was drawing from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's kind of idea that abolition is not about tearing things down, it's about building something new. So I kind of used a metaphor of the white feminist wrecking ball, you know, which can be quite destructive. And this is a toolkit to build something different. But I can see how it might seem quite prescriptive. So maybe I need to think of a different word. And I guess I ended with the questions because I don't want to tell people what to do, but I also didn't want to just raise loads of questions and make loads of critiques and then just say, bye, I'm off now, see you later. So I sort of wanted to give people something to hang on to when they kind of have that question, what do I do? And that question has been the most common question I've been asked by people kind of reading the book. But that is really interesting about the toolkit. I might have to try and think of a different word. If you think of one, let me know.
Yeah, you know, so I, as I said before, I do have so many questions, but I think that that's a good place to end this section on, because certainly there are a lot of questions around being reflexive about where you know, where you are as an individual in the feminist movement. And I think questions of how things have progressed or changed over the years are quite important in that context. So I think that this is a good time to hand over to Angela to talk about gender equality in changing times, because what has actually changed, we wonder. So thanks for now, Alison.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much, Alison and Donna.
Thank
Brilliant.
You. Get back to you later.
You will. I just remind everyone that this is being recorded. So once I work out how to download it and store it properly, it will be up online, and I will send a link out to everyone I can find the emails for, including those who haven't been able to join us because of Eventbrite's idiosyncrasies. So as I said earlier, if you have any questions you'd like to put to Alison or to either Katie or Alice, who are going to be speaking in a moment, then you're very welcome to put them into chat or to raise your hand. I think if you look on your Zoom screen at the very bottom, at the right-hand side, there's something called reactions. You can only be positive in Zoom. You can only put thumbs up or applause. So if you want to try, if you can't put a message into Zoom or you don't want to, you can try putting a thumbs up, and we'll try and get to you that way. But at the moment, we're just going to go back. Thank you, Donna. So we're just going to go back to the idea of what is gender equality. And that's one of the things that the chapters in the edited collection explore, picking up on quite a lot of the themes that Alison has discussed in the last few minutes. How we were perhaps tempted to think that gender equality was in the process of being achieved positively, but it had actually left behind a lot of people. Or to use that metaphor of the white feminist wrecking ball, I think is really effective when you look at these marginalized groups of people. And it's these marginalized groups that Katie and Alice are going to be talking about, people who don't fit into that white heterosexual feminist approach to gender equality. We were also going to be hearing from Wujud Ahmadani, but she's been unable to join us, but she was looking at gender equality in Saudi Arabia, where there is obviously the headlines of women being allowed to drive without guardians in their cars. She was looking at the way that this was being discussed on Twitter, as Saudi Arabia happens to have one of the highest usages of Twitter in the world. But her chapter, you might have to read yourselves. So we're going to start looking at a couple more of these less mainstream white heterosexual communities by going to Dr. Katie Ward and her exploration of the identity of being trans in the contemporary world. So Katie, I think, has PowerPoint for us.
I do indeed. So let me share my screen and hopefully everyone will be able to see. Oh, right. Okay, has that shared?
It has, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Angela. So I'm just going to talk a little bit for 5 minutes about my chapter and what I've been writing about, called Understanding Gender in a Binary Society. There's a few prerequisites I want to mention before we carry on. So I am a cisgender female. I was born with what you will call female anatomy, declared that at birth, and that's how I identify. So there's that kind of, I'm not trans, non-binary or anything like that. And I feel that that's important to say, because the people that are talking to are very aware of their own gender identity and very aware of mine, and that and what they're sharing to me as well. And this chapter is also part of a larger piece of research looking at gender identity in the Northeast and trans lived experiences as well, where we draw on things like media representations and things like that. But for this chapter, I concentrated on one very interesting facet of the research, is about how people talk about themselves and how people categorize themselves in terms of gender. So as a cis woman, for me, the category of woman and being called a woman, I have no issues with. I can claim those assumptions, whether I want to fight against certain assumptions or not. But for me, none of those assumptions that go with woman are particularly uncomfortable. And however, for my participants, it's a lot more difficult in how to describe themselves. So I asked everybody the same question, which would, how would you describe your gender identity? So I'm just going to take you through what people have said, and then we'll have a look at the end and kind of what this means. So for Rachel, how would you describe your gender identity here? So for me, I suppose it's female, but I try not to be too, I'm also concerned about the kind of appropriation, and you know, it's female, but with a but. So Rachel is a trans woman in her early 30s who's been living in the Northeast her entire life as well. So next one we have Michael, who, again, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I'm happy with my body as it is, but in terms of like externally imposed social roles, it doesn't really feel right. So I probably consider myself non-binary. So Michael was a non-binary person there. However, he was traditionally masculine presenting. So for anybody who didn't know him, or he would pass, for want of a better word, as masculine. And this is something that we discussed further on in our research in terms of how he feels about that. But for this, it would be non-binary. So our third participant would Donna, who was just, I'm a trans woman. Now, looking at what Donna said compared to Michael and Rachel there, you can already see that there's a big difference in terms of what people describe as themselves as well. And I'll come back to that in a second. Sophie is female without any qualifiers if it was for anyone. If it was for this, obviously I'm transgender. So what Sophie means here is she was very well aware of our interview situation. She was aware that I'm a cis female, and she was what she called stealth. So she's not out in public. She wants to pass as a cis female, but she wanted to talk to me to talk about a different facet of the transgender community. So it's interesting that she sees herself as female, but in our research interview environment, she can switch her label there to transgender. And then finally we have Terry, who says, I'm not a woman because to be a woman, you have to grow up from being a girl. And to say that in my brain, in my mind, in my heart, I'm a girl, that's as far as it goes. So Terry, when I interviewed her, was actually presenting as cis male, and she, was born male. And again, here she explains that not having gone through adolescence or puberty to experience that, what you would consider sort of a female puberty, for example, she actually sees herself as a girl rather than a woman. So taking these into consideration then, what does that mean? So what I'm suggesting, and what I talk about in my chapter, is that actually it's really uncomfortable for people, or problematic for people, to fit themselves into female and male labels because of the assumptions that go with both of those categories. So if we look at this, it's just to say that there's a pattern of the lexicon not necessarily being able to kind of fully represent a person's identity. And so what happens is, if someone was to ask me what is my gender, I could say woman, and then that wouldn't be questioned. Whereas for some people, their gender identity and talking about it takes a narrative turn. It turns into a story in terms of potentially how they got there. So I'm not a woman. To have to be a woman, you have to grow up from being a girl. I'm a girl, that's as far as it goes. So Terry is telling her story there of her identity. or it turns into an explanation or a justification of why people choose that label. So if we go back to Rachel, then she was talking about not wanting to appropriate cis female identities. So she takes on the category of female, but with this but. So there's this idea that she's not she wants to be female, she sees herself as female, but she's not comfortable with the assumptions and our society assumptions of what it means to be female. So in terms of gender equality and looking at that, I just think it's really difficult for people who are not within this restrictive sort of linguistic binary to be able to describe or feel comfortable with how to describe their identity. And I think that, again, is this constant justification of why people choose categories as well. It is also interesting that this is 4 out of the 5 participants this happened to. And I think so so that's kind of where I'm at with that. So further down in the research, we talk about the media and how the media kind of comes in with that, and how the media are using outdated lexicon and terminology. But I thought this was really interesting in terms of just this one question eliciting such a narrative or a justification. So that's kind of the overview of my chapter there. So I'll just hand back to you, Angela.
Oh, thank you very much, Katie. Yeah, I mean, as you say, the lack of the way that there is almost not a binary, but a tertiary, or male, female, or trans. Mm-hmm. That is, the identity of being trans is very, very nuanced in the very decisive way that trans people are identifying themselves, but they are very determinedly identifying themselves as trans, but not just trans. There is a great variety within that we just don't pick up on in media reporting, which is what you found in your chapter, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think what came up as well in terms of how people describe themselves is a lot of people mistake trans itself as being an identity. So you're male, female, or trans, and that is not something that anyone is comfortable with, because it suggests that trans and non-binary people and stuff are a separate homogenous group away from male and female. So again, I think that also goes to show on to why it takes such an explanation for somebody to label themselves in terms of their gender identity.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you.
So I think that's something we'll be coming back to. Questions, brace yourself. So next, I think we have Alice, Dr. Alice Wu. Alice, are you able to access the shared screen?
I think so.
Excellent. Right, so Alice is going to be talking about her chapter, which looks at gender equality in the Chinese context, which is a very different context to westernized ideas of gender equality to begin with. So thank you very much, Alice.
Hello, I'm Alice from University of Macau, China. First of all, I would like to thank Angela for inviting me to contribute to this fantastic book. And it's a great pleasure to take part in this book launch to discuss gender issues in different social and cultural contexts. My chapter explores the discursive representation and backlash of gender inequality on Chinese internet by drawing upon a case study of an internet buzzword, straight man cancer. Although China is now a communist country that has gender equality written in law, Chinese gender discourse and ideology were deeply rooted in ancient feudalism and Confucianism that feature patriarchal ideologies and imbalanced gender relations. In Chinese history, women's roles and positions were defined by men, and women existed to serve men and the patriarchal social and family structure. The only social role of women was believed to get married, bear and rear children, better be sons, and devote themselves to the family. And sadly, these elements still persist in today's gender discourse and ideology. However, the rise of the internet and social media technologies have opened up the possibility for a co-creation of gender discourse both by men and women. This is seen in the wide use of social media to expose gender discrimination, express women's voices, and ask for legal support. Social media serve as a shared platform for raising higher degree of gender awareness and for virtual feminism. But it is also important to know that China's strict internet censorship monitors the flow of information and the expression of opinions. This means that the state is always intervening in the construction of gender ideologies, discourse, and gender relations in order to maintain social stability and harmony. And this makes actual organized feminist activities and campaigns that may disrupt a harmonious society almost impossible in China. Although organized activities are not working in the Chinese context, there are various ways people can use to fight against gender inequality and raise gender awareness in China. Inventing and mobilizing internet buzzwords is one of them. Straight man cancer is one such example. It is created by Chinese social media users to criticize and resist gender-biased judgmental behaviors and language through a disease metaphor, and this is indicated by the word cancer. So my chapter is based on a discourse analysis of 2 microblogs and their responses on Weibo, China's most popular microblogging service. It demonstrates straight man cancer as a discursive construction that frames the male-dominated gender discourse and patriarchal structure in China as natural and innocuous, and internet buzzwords as ways to challenge the existing gender ideology and promote gender awareness. Interestingly, apart from using internet buzzwords as a tool of criticism, they are also used in daily digital communication in the forms of multimodal memes and stickers and hashtags that create a thread of topics for people to share their personal stories of encountering gender discrimination. And here is an example of an internet meme of straight man cancer. The message conveys a summary of what people infected with this disease would often say, and these are considered the symptoms of straight man cancer. Let's listen to what straight man cancer says. Hi, beauty. How old are you? Young sister, you should not wear makeup at such a young age. I think you look better without makeup. Don't wear makeup when we are together. Send me your selfie, young sister. Why do you buy so many lipsticks? Women should be diligent and thrifty. Do you do housework? I don't like lazy women. Here, people infected with the disease of straight man cancer try to impose their standard of beauty, ways of consumption, and gender labor division in a family on women. But Chinese social media users use these buzzwords for example, in the form of a sticker or a meme to ridicule those sexist statements and behaviors in digital communication. And by using this internet buzzword in its creative and multimodal forms in daily communication, Chinese users try to push back gender inequality and promote a stronger sense of gender awareness on Chinese internet. And thanks very much. This is about my chapter. And to be honest, this is my first article about gender inequality. And thanks to Angela.
Thank you, Alice. It was a really interesting chapter. And as you say, for someone who hadn't really looked at gender before, it was, well, up to your usual standard of amazingness. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh, right. Right, now we have an open floor for anyone for about 10 minutes if anyone would like to ask any questions based on the topics that have been raised today. And I know that there are lots and lots of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. So does anybody want to kick off by popping a question into chat or by perhaps raising their hand, if I can work out how to see that? Oh, I'm having problems getting into chat now. It's one of those days. I hate technology.
I can see the chat if
Can you? Oh.
Yeah, I don't see a question yet, but can I use this opportunity to ask one myself?
Go on. You know you want.
I'm already on. So I was interested, well, two very interesting discussions, I think. Different, but interesting discussions. And I think I wanted to ask Katie about her chapter, and I just wondered, because you mentioned before that you see yourself as being cisgender, and I just wondered what motivated you to write about about transgender issues.
Well, so before I started working and on the thesis, I was working for a LGBT charity, homelessness charity called the Albert Kennedy Trust. To be fair, that's a job I just sort of fell into. It was kind of not necessarily seeking anything out, but as I was there, it became more apparent that trans and non-binary people are sort of 30 years behind in terms of the support that they're receiving, in terms of how they're being treated. Well, I say that this was probably nearly 7 or 8 years ago now, so things have maybe moved on, but at the time it was kind of about 30 years behind compared to the LGB counterparts. And it was just, we were getting more and more trans young people through the door, and I think just being in that environment, getting to know the people, getting to know their own stories, and getting to know that the difficulties that they were facing is sparked this idea of looking at this more in depth. So I've always had an interest in linguistics and sociolinguistics and language analysis, and I think that as well there was a gap in the literature looking at gender variance and gender non-conformity as well. So it sort of was a happy, harmonious kind of coming together, and then I ended up with Angela on Angela's office. So yeah, so that's kind of where the idea stemmed from.
Yeah, I mean, oh, there's a question, so I'll shut up. Catherine Donovan, I think, has a question.
Catherine, did you have a question you wanted to put to one of them or all of them?
Hello, yes, I've got a question for everybody, really, I hope, because thank you so much. There are such interesting papers there, and because I come from this issue of gender and sex and sexuality from a sociological point of view, and I'm just interested how there seems to be, I don't know whether it's conceptually useful. In sociology, we would see a distinction between gender and sex in order to understand how people make sense of their lives, really, and to kind of understand that there are kind of essentialist or biological understandings of body, particularly in relation to reproduction, but also then kind of cultural, political, social, historical factors that produce gender. And I just wonder whether that's something that other people have thought, you know, how they've understood gender in their chapters or in their work, and how. I've just read Testosterone Rex. I don't know if people have read it, but it's just really made me think about how we've kind of segued into talking about gender without and forgetting this issue of sex.
Does anybody want to anybody want to say anything about that distinction that is often made between sex and gender?
I mean, I think in terms of the work that I've done and the sort of the whole piece of research, is it was sort of touched upon, but the focus was more about how people sort of made sense of their own lives and made meaning through the words and that they use and that we use. So I think in terms of our conversations and stuff, it wasn't something that was explicitly talked about in how people feel about that distinction in terms of sex and gender. And I was very much aware that I was also a participant in these interviews as well, and I was learning at the same time, so I was quite led on in terms of the conversations we had in what the people who were talking to me wanted to talk about. So I don't know whether that necessarily answers your question, but that's kind of where I was sort of weaving with my research on that issue.
Thank you.
Alison, did you have anything that you would like to say on that distinction that is often made?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel quite ambivalent about it for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously we all kind of know the arguments around sort of biological sex not being quite as binary as we had previously thought, which are kind of often part of the discussion about gender diversity and about transgender as well. The other thing that I draw on in my work is the idea of sex difference as maybe something biological, but something which was given meaning fairly recently in kind of the colonial period. I don't know whether you've looked at Kyla Schuller's work on how the science of sex and the science of race kind of went hand in hand. And sex difference, expressed in a very binary way, was seen as the property of bourgeois white people, while people of colour became a kind of more undifferentiated mass in different ways. So kind of First Nations people were seen as being relics of the past, kind of ancient cultures which were really part of the land. Black people were seen as being kind of less than human, and other people of color were seen in kind of Asian people were seen as kind of ungendered in a different way, in a kind of a more neutral way. And she kind of threads through these two sciences and how they kind of intertwined, which doesn't mean that there's nothing real about sex difference, but it means that the way that we understand it is gendered. And, you know, I mean, that's Judith Butler's argument, isn't it? That sex is what the social construct of gender points to justify itself. And they're also raced, in that the idea of a sex difference is something which kind of really came to the forefront during this period. I mean, my thoughts are perhaps it doesn't really matter, because perhaps we need to be asking not what is a woman and what is a man, but who does the work of care? And we can acknowledge that it's a lot of cisgender women who are doing this work of care, but it's not just cisgender women. It's people of other genders, and especially actually trans and queer people have done a lot of care work, because they haven't necessarily been part of the family in the same way that cis people have, or heterosexual people have. So who does the work of care is one question. And then who is more vulnerable to violence? And again, we might acknowledge that cisgender women are kind of overrepresented in this group of who is vulnerable to violence, but it's not just cisgender women who are vulnerable to violence, it's people of other genders. And again, kind of trans and gender non-conforming people are very much at risk of violence because they challenge the idea of binary gender. It's kind of a form of punishment So sexual violence is, you know, I mean, I've been kind of theorizing it along 4 vectors, but one vector is about perpetuating binary gender by keeping women in their place and also punishing people who don't conform to the binary. So we can ask that question as well. And maybe we don't need to essentialize it. Maybe we, obviously there are biological characteristics. Some of us give birth, some of us don't, etc. But those aren't always distributed along binary gender lines, and maybe we don't need to kind of fit them into that model. I don't know whether that's helpful at all.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting stuff, and I would say bodies are also classed, aren't they? You know, and indeed, obviously, there's the cult of the perfect body and the able-bodied body. So there's kind of all manner of identities are produced in and through bodies. Yeah,
exactly. And when we say what is gender equality, I mean, that's, you know, that's the thing, isn't it? Equality for who? You know, because if we focus on gender equality but not other forms, you know, if we have gender equality but not disabled equality, then disabled women will not be free. You know, if we have gender equality but not race equality, then women of colour will not be free. Yeah, so I think it's much more about that matrix, you know, as you were saying.
Yeah. Yes, I know that in the gender equality book that came through very clearly, and that's why I think these and the papers that are the talks that Alice and Katie have given actually go very well with the arguments that you develop in your book, and that equality is not something we can ever fully understand, because there are so many different people involved and so many different identities that people are able to be performing, that we just can't do that. And there are identities that are imposed on us in particular that people are breaking out from, and that's where inequality is particularly relevant. In fact, there was one of the chapters in the gender equality book which Kim Gilligan wrote about the men who are involved in this and the inequality that they experience. And it's one of those facets of inequality that we simply overlook a lot of the time. So I think that the whole question of what we mean by gender equality is one that we couldn't ever hope to have covered in an hour. So a great effort on everyone's part to try and do that. We don't actually have time for any more questions unless anyone has one last burning question that they need to ask. But I think that there is, oh, Donna, of course. What I was going to say before Donna comes in with her very last final burning question is that I think this might be something we can pick up again in a better organised way, with a more accurately disseminated Zoom link at another time. But Donna.
Yeah, thank you for letting me ask this final question. As I said, I just have so many questions to ask. But obviously we're going through quite a seismic occasion at the moment, a seismic moment, I should say, with the COVID crisis and, you know, all of the inequalities that have come to the surface. And I just wondered, this is a question for everybody, basically, what next for you in terms of, you know, how do you think this sort of, you know, moment, this historic moment will influence what you do next? You know, what is next? What do you think is next for you? And anybody can take that one. So Alison is there first.
Do you want me to go first?
Or who's there?
Oh, Katie. Katie's there too.
No, I was just going to say that, because it's been a while since I've written about this and studied this and sort of talked about this in depth. So when these kind of things were 2016 and 17, and to be quite honest, I feel that having finished up, I'm sort of out of the game a little bit. So everything has already progressed so much in terms of gender identity and how people see themselves. So I think I've got a lot of researching to be doing to catch up. So I'm not entirely sure what's next for this, because things are just changing so rapidly in terms of gender and gender identities in this kind of respect. So that's sort of where I'm at.
Okay.
If in doubt, blame COVID, Katie. That's what.
Well, yeah, you know.
Oh, Alice, do you think that you can see any changes happening in the context that you were studying? Oh, you're on mute.
My headphone just died.
Oh, sorry about that.
But did you hear me? Great. Well, as I haven't explored as much as the others have done in this area, what I have observed in my context is that, well, maybe because I'm a optimistic person, so what I see is the bright side of China. Well, although I am often critical of China when I write papers, but I still see hope in this country, and I do hope that gender issues will get more attention in future studies, as now gender studies in China is a rather marginalized area, and so are the people, especially those LGBT groups. They don't even have their voices heard. But now, with social media being an important platform for people to express their opinions, we gradually hear more of them. Like they try to speak out for themselves, and they try to get the attention from the whole society. And so when we have the some good news from other countries about like liberating or more emancipating for LGBT groups and other transgender groups, people are very excited. So they post on social media to share the good news. And I see this as hope for this country. But to be honest, I don't know much about this area yet, and I would love to hear more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, social media is where your study is attached in a way, isn't it, Alison? Because you're looking at essentially the Me Too movement, which is a social media movement. So where do you think it's going next, or where are you going next with it?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think like Alice, I have some hope because I think that 2020 has been a really tough year, but I think it's also exposed in ways that it's now pretty impossible to ignore just how cruel racial capitalism is, just how unequal our societies are, and also how interdependent we are. So I think COVID really shows once and for all that for one of us to be okay, we all have to be okay. And that if we don't look after the most marginalized people among us, then it won't work for anyone. And I think that obviously some people have known this for a long time, but what I'm seeing is more privileged people having a real awareness of that now as well. And the same with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think the talk of abolition has become much more mainstream. I mean, you've got Mariam Kaba in the New York Times writing about abolition for people who haven't kind of come across it before. And obviously that will die down, but I have some hope that we can hang on to a little bit of that, and that some people who maybe didn't know before now understand exactly what the criminal punishment system is for. So I think that what I want to do is have a lot more conversations like this to start with, and talk through, you know, with other women, other feminists, where we should go next and how we start trying to widen that project of building something different, because there are lots of people who are building different things already. But I think more of us need to take part in that, and we all need to do our small part. And I guess I see that as part of my purpose for the upcoming years, is to try and facilitate more conversations about, you know, how we can all play our small part.
Yes, but I think it is that incremental step, isn't it, now that we need to take after the real seismic change that was 2017, the emergence of the Me Too movement. And as Katie was saying, that happened to be the year after she stopped collecting data. Oh. Well, I think that we are going to have to leave it there, but thank you to everybody who has come along, and especially to our 4 speakers and Donna for doing such a fantastic job of exploring gender equality in what we now think of as being very much turbulent times rather than changing times. And I'm sure we're all going to go away and think, I hadn't thought of that before. The things that we take for granted. So thank you all again. And what I'll do is I'll get the recording of this into a place where I can share it, and I'll make sure that everyone receives the link to that, which means that you will get to see it, she says optimistically. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.